Well, there was an interesting survival story that came out of the high Sierra Nevada mountains. There was a woman by the name of Lauren Elder, and on April 26, 1976, she was invited to take a plane flight on a little Cessna. And she would leave her house in Oakland, and the idea was to fly to Furnace Creek in Death Valley. So no big deal. It should be like a lot of fun. I mean, when somebody invites you to go fly on a plane, it sounds like a lot of fun. So she's wearing high heels and a blouse and just a skirt, and she gets on the plane. It's an evening flight, and they take off from Oakland, and they start making their way, ascending up into the Sierra Nevada mountains. And according to her testimony, she's in the back of the plane looking around, and she looked left and then looked right, and she saw that there was a granite wall that was coming closer to her, and then she has no memory after that, except that she woke up in the middle of a crumbled aircraft sitting at the top of the Sierra Nevada mountains. It was the crash was located near Mount Bradley, which is about 12,460 feet. It is the month of April, and so there's snow everywhere. It's freezing cold, and night is just beginning to fall. As she wakes up, that several of her teeth have been smashed out. Her right arm is fractured. Her leg has a big gash in it. It's beginning to swell. And of course, there is the general impact, the hydrostatic shock of being in an airplane crash. Sadly, her two companions were mortally wounded. And so that night, they tried to stay as warm as they could, but by morning time, she woke up alone. The other two men in the plane had died. So here she is. It's April, 12,460 feet at the top of the Sierra Nevada mountains, and she has three choices. She can go to the west and make her way down the mountains, which isn't very steep, but it's miles and miles and miles. She can stay there and hope to be rescued, or she can go east and make her way down the sheer cliffs into the Owens Valley, which is just south of Bridgeport. So she decides to go east. With a gashed leg that is swelling and an arm that is fractured, and with a general shock, she makes her way down the mountains, and she spends the next 36 hours there in the wilderness. And so she woke up the morning, and she didn't make it to safety until the next day at nighttime, 36 hours. At one point, she had to scale a dry waterfall, and it was the type of rock climbing that one slip and you're done, and of course she has a bad arm. She made her way down, and by the second day, she was beginning to hallucinate. She saw some people and went towards them, and then found out it was some branches that she had mistaken for people. And then she came across a house and went towards the house, and then as she got closer, it ended up being a boulder, and so she's really, really out of it. But finally, after 35 or 36 hours, she makes her way into the town of Independence, California. But her timing couldn't have been worse. Charles Manson was on trial in that very city at that very time, and many Charles Manson followers were hanging around town. This is a small town that isn't used to weirdos hanging about. And so she comes walking into town like a zombie with her hair all frazzled and her clothing all ripped, and she's all bloodied and bruised and battered and confused, and she walks into town and everyone thinks it's a crazed Manson follower. So eventually the sheriff got a hold of her, and they got her into a hospital, and thus ended her 36-hour trial. Doesn't sound like a lot of fun. You know, I wonder, when you're in a situation like that, one of the things that keeps you alive is your headspace. If you are already defeated, you're not going to make it. If you don't have any reason to live, if you don't have any reason to push and push and push, you're not going to make it. Now, I wonder this question. What would it have done to Lauren Elder's headspace if she spent the entire 36 hours blaming people? I cannot believe that God would allow this to happen to me. I cannot believe that I got on this plane. I cannot believe that I wasn't more prepared. I cannot believe that the pilot crashed the plane. I cannot believe, and she could have named off all of these different things, blaming anybody and everybody and everything, including God, including herself, including the pilot. What would that have done to her will to live? Would that have been healthy? Would that have helped her to press forward? I don't think so. But on the opposite end, if you put at the front of your mind the right thing, like, I'm out in the wilderness and I have 3 kids that need their mother to make it home alive. That's a reason to push. Whatever it might be. James, as we get into James chapter 1, verses 12 to 18, one of the things that he's going to challenge us to do is to endure. He understands that all of us have our own, in a sense, a plane crash. We have our own trials, our own temptations, our own persecutions. But one of the things that does not help us as we are going through these plane crashes is to play the blame game. And so if you would, turn with me to James chapter 1, and we're going to read just verses 12 to 18. And the big idea here is for us to endure without blame. Just so you know, while you're turning there, James is Jesus' younger half-brother. He's the leader at the Church of Jerusalem. He's writing to Christian Jews that are scattered around the Mediterranean world. His letter is a general letter that is just a basic idea of this is what Christian conduct should look like. And in this first section, he's addressing the various trials and temptations, plane crashes that we might face. So chapter 1, beginning with verse 12 from the ESV, this is what it says. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life which God has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. And then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Of his own will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. In James chapter 1, he's talking about trials and temptations, and I have it abbreviated on the board with T and T's, and this is the message so far. Handled correctly, trials and temptations will lead us to maturity. But if you ask in faith, God will give you wisdom during trials and temptations. And he even tells us that we can boast in our trials and temptations because God has a high place for his people. But in the next section, James wants us to know that we've got to endure these trials without blaming God and about blaming other people. And we've got to take responsibility for this. Now, if you look at verse 12, the first thing is that we need endurance. We need endurance to overcome trials and temptations. Now, if you look at verse 12, James uses two words or two phrases to describe this type of endurance. He says the first thing is that this person needs to remain steadfast. And then he goes on to say, he refers to has stood the test. So he's using different phraseology to basically describe someone who keeps pushing, someone who has not given up, someone who hasn't folded. Now notice that in both of these phrases, it's not just the person has stood, it's not just the person has remained steadfast, and that would be difficult enough. This person is being lauded for doing it under trial. I mean, it's difficult enough to hold your ground. It's difficult enough to remain standing. It's difficult enough to not give up. But James is saying that these guys are doing it under some sort of duress. He also says that the person who endures has two things coming to her. He or she, according to the passage, will be blessed. He or she will receive the crown of life. Now, it's curious to note this phrase, crown of life. It's only used one other time in Scripture, and in both times it's used to refer to people who are undergoing persecution. Now, look what the Lord says in Revelation chapter 2. He's talking to Christians who are undergoing persecution. He says, do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you, there it is again, the crown of life. Now, what type of crown is this? Well, it's not a crayon when you write with. It's a crown for the head. But what kind of crown? Well, this isn't a ruling crown of authority. This is probably envisioned as what we would call a winner's wreath. In Greco-Roman games and the Olympics and so on, when you completed a race or you ran the race or won the race, at the end would be a crown, but it was a wreath and it was placed on your head to show everyone that you won, that you survived, that you made it, you didn't drop out. So it wasn't a ruling crown, it was a winner's crown. And I know today some of you are probably very tired. Some of you may be enduring your own plane crash, your own survival situation. And I know that you're probably tired of working. You're tired of the politics. You're tired of the social media bickering. You're tired of the mask, no mask argument. You're tired of seeing your favorite businesses shut down. You're tired of hearing the word COVID-19. You're tired because you have, on top of all this stuff, your own personal trials and temptations. And so we ask the question, is there any hope? Is there any power? Is there anything that God offers us? We know that He wants us to endure, but how do we do it? Well, I have two things for you. I don't have them. They're from the Scripture. The first one is from Galatians 6. And I just want you to know that if you're tired and exhausted and are in your own wilderness experience, the first part of this verse is probably going to irritate you. Here it is. It already says, let us not grow weary of doing good. So you're already tired. You're already frustrated. You're already in a survival situation. And Paul says, don't be tired of doing good. Well, thanks a lot for that advice. But he goes on to elaborate. And he says, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. So he says, don't grow weary of doing good. Why? Because in time you are going to reap. Now, this is a farming term. This means you invested all this time in breaking up the ground and planting the ground and watering the ground and tending the plants, but there comes a season where you actually get something back from all of your labor. And he says, if you don't give up, you're going to get something back from your labor. In other words, this is simply a way of saying that you're going to get paid. You're not running this race for free. You're not going through this for no reason. You are going to be paid. There's going to be a benefit for what you complete. Now, it may be in the next life. It may be in this life. But you are not working this fight for free. You will see fruit at the end of your labor. Now, some people might say, well, isn't that a shallow reason to only continue running because you're going to get a prize? Well, I don't think so. I think that that's the only reason that could be bad. But all of us, do you go to work for free? I don't go to work for free. We all want to work and then get something back. That's normal. That's reasonable. That's rational. And God is saying the same thing. If you don't give up, keep running, there's going to be something for you at the end. So run in such a way as to earn that prize. Now, the next one is from Hebrews chapter 11, or rather chapter 12. And the writer says this, let us run with endurance. Now there's that word again. He uses that verse or that word because he knows that this race is difficult. He knows this is not an easy thing. This isn't a stroll in the park. You're going to need endurance. And then he says the race that is set before us. When you become a Christian, when you confess Christ as Lord, you have just entered into a race. It has been set for us. And then look what he says, looking to Jesus. In other words, when you're running this race and your legs are burning, your feet have blisters on them, your lungs are about to explode, and you can't even see what's going on, and you're wondering, why are you running this race? And you look back, and you had friends, family members that were running with you, and guess what? They've dropped out. They've stopped running. They're long gone. And you look back, and it seems like no one is with you anymore, and you're in this wilderness running by yourself, and you can blame God, you can blame yourself, blame everyone. But the writer of Hebrews says, looking to Jesus. So as you're running, you've got your eyes set on the prize. You're running to the Lord and for the Lord and under the power of the Lord. Now look what it says. He is the founder and the perfecter of our faith. Now this is awesome because as you are running, God is actively perfecting your faith. He is working on you. He's growing you, maturing you, chiseling you into a more noble, Christ-like creature as you continue to run. And you might say, this is so hard. If only Jesus understood. Well, he says that he ran his own race. He endured the cross, despising the shame. And he did this for the joy that was set before him. So we will be empowered to endure if we will keep our focus on him. And so James wants us to know right from the very beginning, when you're in your own plane crash situation, you've got to endure. But the second thing that we need, according to James chapter 1, is we need ownership. We need ownership to overcome trials and temptations. Now, what do I mean when I say ownership? Well, as I mentioned, there's a tendency to blame God or to blame other people, and I understand that. The tendency to blame God is normal. Now, I didn't say right, I said normal. You know, that plane crash in 1976, after a thorough investigation, it was discovered that the crash occurred because of pilot error. Somebody made a mistake, and it thrust her into this situation. Now, this March, I will celebrate my 26th year being on church staff. 26 years being in the vocational ministry, and during that time, doing ministry for all this time, what I have heard from people, the most common objection as to why a person cannot believe in God, it always comes down to this. How can I believe in God when He allowed fill in the blank to happen? We want to blame God for all of these things. And so James is going to address this issue. He's going to give us some information about the nature of God, the nature of humankind, and the nature of reality. And so the first thing he wants us to know, verse 13, is that God does not tempt us. James's rationale is this: God cannot be tempted by evil, and therefore he doesn't tempt anyone. You see, God is omnipotent. And what that means is there is nothing more powerful than God or of equal power than God. And what that means is there's no external power on the outside of God that can try to lure God into being tempted. There's nothing on the outside that has power to get God to do anything that is contrary to His own character. There's no one who has the ability to manipulate or coax God into doing something that He doesn't want to do. The only thing that He will change Himself for or respond to is when His own children humbly request in prayer. Then He will change, but He's not being manipulated. So by His very nature, God does not tempt anyone. He cannot be tempted, and He will not tempt anyone. Now, I will say this, that He doesn't tempt anyone directly. Well, why do I say directly? Because He does allow us to live in a world where we face the world, the flesh, and the enemy. We have temptations in this world, and He's allowed us to live here, but He Himself does not do it directly. Here's what James is getting at. When we give into temptation and we fail and we have to face the consequences, we cannot blame God. Why? Well, look at verses 14 and 15. Because it is our own evil desires that tempt us. James is going to use two metaphors here. He's going to use a fishing metaphor, and he's going to use a reproduction metaphor. And these are going to happen very fast. He says here in verse 14 that each of us is tempted when we are lured by our own evil desires. And that lure, the word lure, is a literal translation. It's a fishing term. It means to bait or to lure a fish. Now, here's the interesting thing about fishing. Now, maybe I'm reading too much into this, but you know, bass fishing is a little different. In one sense, when you throw out a bait for a bass, they come up and they smell it, and they see it wiggling, and they might even taste it. And then when they grab a hold of that bait and they get hooked, then they're caught. So the first thing is it's based upon a desire. There's a fleshly desire that says, I want that. But there's another way that you can catch bass. I mean, obviously you can throw grenades, but I do recommend that. It's a lot of fun. But the other legal way to catch a bass is by upsetting them. There's crankbaits and different lures out there that make noise. And the bass, they don't go after it because they're hungry. They go after it because they're mad. Because some other fish is in their territory and they're making noise, they get upset, they lose their temper, and bam, they hit that lure and they get caught. In other words, in the analogy of the bass here, it covers both losing your temper and doing something because your flesh is telling you to do. That covers a lot of territory right here. Wouldn't it be that most of the mistakes that we make come from either my flesh wants me to do it or I lost my temper and I did it? I mean, that's going to cover a lot of stuff. So he's saying that it's not God's fault, but what happens is there's a lure and we either give in the temptation or we get mad and we take the lure. So then he goes on and he switches from a fishing analogy to a reproduction analogy. He says, desire must be conceived. And then when conceived, it grows and grows and grows, and it gives birth to sin. And sin is this little baby, and it grows up, and when it's fully mature, it becomes death. What James is saying, using both a fishing and reproduction metaphor, is that this stuff comes from our own evil desires, and James says you can't blame God, this is on you. It is very common to want to blame anybody and everybody and everything for our own evil desires. And by the way, the first sin ever committed was associated with blaming one's spouse. Genesis 3:12, the man said, the woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me the fruit of the tree and I ate it. He's kind of indirectly blaming God because it was you gave her to me. But he's really blaming his wife. And I will say that I think that is a very common thing for us to do, to fall into, to blame our spouses for our troubles. Now, I don't mean to suggest that your spouse doesn't make any mistakes. Your spouse may do wicked, horrible, wrong, ungodly things. But the command for us to be noble, godly creatures is completely disconnected from the behavior of our spouses. So if our spouse is a wicked person, that does not justify us, in turn, being wicked back. Look what the people at the church of Corinth were doing. Now, this is kind of a complicated argument. Let me just read this and I'll unpack it. It says, food is meant for the stomach and the stomach for food, and God will destroy both one and the other. The body is not meant for sexual immorality, but the Lord, and the Lord for the body. So here's what's happening. You have in the church of Corinth a church that is struggling in multiple different ways with sexual immorality, and Paul is responding to their letter, and this is the argument that the people were making. And this is a pretty good argument. They're really trying here. The argument is, God created me with a stomach, and by nature of creation, because I have this receptacle, he intended for me to put food in it. God made it. I feel hungry. I put food in it. So the stomach is for food. Food is for stomach. The argument is, in the same way, God created me with these organs, and they have desires, and since God created it, then I have to satisfy it. Makes perfect sense. And Paul says, no. The body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord. And so basically they're saying, this is God's fault. I was created this way. And he says, no, your body was designed to glorify the Lord. And so James throws a bucket of cold water on any attempt for us to blame the Lord when we face trials and temptations, because many of them are caused by ourselves. Now, to further clarify the nature and the character of God, James also says, look at verses 16 and 17, that God gives us good gifts. Now notice, he begins this section with, do not be deceived. Now, this is so important. If your theology is such that you blame God for your troubles, then you will be stuck in a perpetual self-made cycle whose only exit is the application of personal responsibility. And folks, we've got to be warned, this is a dangerous place to be. Until we take 100% responsibility for our lives, our actions, and our attitudes, we will never be free. We will never grow. It will always be somebody else's fault, and we will never be able to move on. It's like the guy who went to a marriage counselor, and he said, we're having all these marital problems, and it's 90% my wife's fault. And the marriage counselor wasn't quite sure that was true. But he told the man, if that's true, then you need to take 100% responsibility for your 10%. So we've got to be warned. If we live our lives in such a way that it's always someone else's fault, we're not going to be able to run the race, because it's just not going to work. Now, here's a statement that I've heard made. This isn't from the scripture. This is just an observation, and you can tell me whether you think it's accurate or not. This is what it says. Whoever you are, whatever you've done, whatever you have, by the time you're 40, it's your fault. Now, what they mean is that we all grow up in different homes. Some people had parents. Some people were poor. Some people were wealthy. We all grew up with different circumstances and different things that held us back. But at a certain point, regardless of how bad your childhood was, you had to make a choice and step out and become the person that God wanted you to be. And by 40, you will have time. You will have had the time to do that. Now, I can't argue either way. It's an observation, something to consider. Now, I want you to notice something. He says, when he says, do not be deceived, he also says, my dear brothers. Notice, once again, he's talking to Christians. He's not talking to non-Christians who are being deceived. He's talking to Christians who have confessed Christ as Lord, and the tendency is for them to be deceived, to think that it's God's fault. But what he wants to go on to tell us is it's not only not God's fault, not only does God not tempt us, but he is the source of every good and perfect gift that comes into our lives. You know, the longer I live, the less I trust myself and the more I think I trust God. The longer I live, the more I look back and I recognize his absolute grace and mercy upon my life. The longer I live, the more I look back and see how many times that he saved me from my own stupidity. The longer I live, I look back over my shoulder and I see the debris of wreckage that I myself have caused, and yet I see his good and perfect gifts constantly appearing in my life. And my friends, if you will spend your life walking with God, you will look over your shoulder over time, and his good and perfect gifts will become more and more apparent. I challenge you, find some elderly saint in the church, some older man, older woman who shows up every Sunday and smiles and sings and loves the Lord, and they will tell you after 60, 70 years of following after him that every good and perfect gift comes from this Father. But James goes on to give one more description about the nature of God. He says, verse 17, that God is the Father of lights. Now, we know that James and the Sermon on the Mount have some connection. And on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus refers to us as lights of the world. And so if God is the Father of lights, he's like the headlight, and he sends us out as little lights into the world. But James also wants us to know that analogies can be imperfect, because any light you can eclipse, you can put it out, you can put a shadow on it. But he says in verse 17 that this light, the Father of lights, is one that is not influenced by shadows. You can't shadow him, you can't eclipse him, and he does not change. He is constant. And so the final word is that we have an unchanging light who gives us, his little lights, good gifts and sends us out into the world. It could be today that you just got out of that plane. It's crashed, there's wreckage everywhere, and you've got a wilderness adventure in front of you. It could be that the plane crash was last year and you're still recovering. It could be you just boarded the plane and you know what's coming. James wants us to know that if you will forget about blaming other people and blaming God, but you will just set your sight on Jesus Messiah, no matter how hard it gets, he is going to strengthen you to put one foot in front of the other, to keep pushing and to not give up. And at the end, you've got that crown of life, that runner's wreath waiting for you, if you will stand firm. So my brothers and sisters, will you stand firm and keep fighting the good fight today?